Well, this morning it's not just a good morning, but I'd like to extend to Camilla and Rami and other Muslim students in class, Ramadan Mubarak. Be careful with these guys. They're going to be a little bit low blood sugar around this time of the day for the next few weeks. And a belated Shana Tova to Jordan and the other Jewish members of the class. I said that I think if you got my course web announcement, you'll know that I will be able to be at most of my office hours today from 2 to 2:45 or something like that. Also, I wanted to share with you the good news that that little booklet that I was talking about on the first day, Hope or Terror, it's been given to 100 diplomats at an international meeting in Berlin. It's been spread all over the world through the peace movement. I think every continent I heard of this, somebody who's gotten a copy. And Representative Lynn Woolsey is going to be giving it to all members of Congress in the next session. So just watch this country turn around. So that shows you, Carrie, just become a peace major and win fame and fortune. Yeah, I've often said that the big money is really in peace research. We all ought to follow it. So we're going to sort of resume sum up the South Africa phase, and I think we'll be falling a little bit behind. We want to do that, then take a pause and look at this classic document that came out of it in 1909, namely Hind Swaraj. Have a discussion on that. It's got so many basic topics about nonviolence in it that we can take as much time as we want to on that, and then get into the first part of the India struggle. Let's say, if we can, I'd like to try and sketch over about 1915 when he arrives there till 1924. 1924 to 1928 was a little bit of a downtime after some explosive experiments in the earlier years. And I think you'll notice that there's a sort of 10-year rhythm, that there's something that climaxes in the early 20s, climaxes in the early 30s, and then climaxes again, and finally with Quit India in 1942. And in between, it's mostly constructive program and laying the groundwork and positioning yourself, and then you have these oppositional, confrontational, nonviolent moment type episodes at this 10-year rhythm, which is sort of an interesting observation. But to go back to South Africa for just a second, there's a book called Gandhi Through Western Eyes, and there's an essay on it, on his youth and his life in South Africa. And here's kind of a summary paragraph I thought we might find useful. It has regretfully to be recorded that this victory for Satyagraha, climaxed in 1913, did not endure. The South African government had been shamed into reform. It had not resolved to reform as a result of change of heart. Now, this is interesting. I think we can discern three kind of grades of conversion in nonviolence. One is just pure coercion, where people have no choice and have to knuckle under and do what you want. Then there's something that they're calling shame. You get shamed into it. You get awakened to the fact that what you're doing is wrong. But it's more, if you're familiar with these terms from anthropology, it's more shame than guilt. Anthropologists talk about a shame culture versus a guilt culture. And the difference is, in the shame culture, your behavior is influenced or controlled by other members of your community. In a guilt culture, you change your own behavior according to your own sensitivities, your own feelings about it. So I think we could set this up as an interesting possibility, that when you get to change an opponent who's doing something that you will not tolerate through nonviolence, the least enduring way to do it is through coercion. In fact, you wouldn't really want to call that principled nonviolence at all, but there are times when you have to do it. I cited the example of Pinochet in Chile, where, you know, he had to be removed from office because thousands of people were being tortured and killed, and you had an opportunity to get him out of there. Of course, you take it. But I would say there's like zero change of heart in the case of Pinochet. Then the South Africans were more or less forced to grant the Indians some rights, some concessions, because of public opinion. Where the whole world is watching, and they're starting to get very ugly and very brutal, and so they find themselves exposed when it's not working well for them. But that's okay. It's still not the best, and they are gonna swing back in the other direction when nobody's looking. That's the problem. But the best way, though it isn't a particularly comfortable emotion, the best way is to really acknowledge yourself that what you've been doing is very wrong. And of course, the flip side of that is you overcome your alienation with the victim. So you've been dehumanizing them. So there's really two things going on here: guilt and rehumanization, which is permanent, which is a real spiritual gain, real uplift. Everybody benefits from this, and it's more or less permanent. So the success, our man is telling us here, the success of South African Satyagraha was in this middle category. Let's try these ideas out, see if they work. I'd never really thought of it in quite this way, so next week I may come in and say that was stupid, let's go back to something else. But right now that seems sensible. So the government had been shamed into reform. It had not resolved to reform as a result of a change of heart, which we're calling rehumanization. The great majority of white South Africans have remained hostile to the claims of their Indian fellow nationals, the claims to receive legal or social equality. Full citizenship has never been conceded. So it's a limited success in terms of what it does to the regime. But we have to remember in nonviolence always, when you're assessing how something succeeded or didn't succeed, that you're looking at the whole environment, the whole situation, and not just what it does to the opponent. Take an extreme case. There's an American Universalist minister from the early 19th century named Aidan Ballou, who started a community in Massachusetts called Hopedale in about 1815. And he wrote a book called Christian Non-Resistance in All Its Major Principles Explained and Defended. They did not like snappy titles in the 19th century. You know. You could not sell Marlboro cigarettes very easily in that era. Anyway, in this book, Christian Non-Resistance, which is very right on in terms of nonviolence, and I used to even assign it in this class. He says, let's say that you're faced suddenly with an overwhelming opponent, and you face that person with what he calls Christian non-resistance, which we're calling nonviolence, and it doesn't quote work, unquote. The person, let's take the worst case scenario. They came to kill you and they kill you. Still, if you shed your body, if you leave this life without succumbing to hatred, that's a big thing. That's a big gain. You have accomplished something which is going to help you internally, and that is going to, as we were talking in the early weeks of the semester, we can't rule out that that affects other people positively and helpfully. Of course, we would like to have a little bit more. We'd like to stay alive, little things like that. I don't know if you've seen The Brothers-in-Law with Peter Falk and Alan Arkin, where Peter Falk is recruiting Alan Arkin into the CIA, and he tells him about all these wonderful benefits. He says, but you have to stay alive. That's the key to the benefits program. Well, it's not, it's, you know, it's a key to some benefits in the nonviolence program, but in the last analysis, it may not be the only thing we have to hold out for. So let's look now at what it did for the resistors. It was this limited success, provisional success for the opponents, but at least the 8-year campaign had shown what amazing self-discipline and courage can be displayed by simple, unlettered men and women under inspired leadership. And that was a very big change. That's Gandhi knew that he could take that back to India. He had done it on the fringes of the empire. Now he could go right into the heart, the belly of the beast. Moreover, it had led to a curiously close relationship of mutual regard between two of the outstanding men of their time, Gandhi and Smuts. And of course, that's the other dimension that it always leads to the cementing of personal relationships. But at least he had put to the test his idea that people did not have to be educated, they did not have to be enfranchised, they did not have to have social leverage in order to be aroused and turned into an effective tool for social change, even aimed against an overwhelming force. And if you read, there's a kind of imaginative conversation in Ishran's Gandhi the Man, where it's as though Gandhi and Smuts, when they're having that famous meeting in prison in 1908, and Gandhi tells Smuts about his demands, and Smuts says, "Is there anything else?" And Gandhi says, "Yes, I've come here to fight your government." And Smuts says, "Oh, really? Anything you'd like to add?" And Gandhi says, "Yes, I'm going to win." And Smuts says, is kind of stunned and says, "Oh, really? Now how do you expect to do that?" And Gandhi says, "With your help." Now that's not a historical recorded conversation, but it's like they could easily have said that. That is more or less what happened. You get at your opponent in such a way that you start to convert him or her into a friend, and then there's no fight anymore, and then everybody wins. But to sum up then a little bit what it was exactly that he had discovered, there's a neat way to contrast the Satyagraha that he was working on there with passive resistance, which is what it was usually compared to. Because there was a movement going on in Britain at the time, especially in 1902, by a group of people called the Nonconformists. They wanted basically to have the right to educate their children in their own way, and the government was making rules for the education of the whole British system, which they didn't want to go along with. And they didn't have much representation in Parliament or money. It was sort of like the homeschooling movement that goes on in the States today. But we've given the homeschooling movement a lot of leeway, and the British government was not doing that. So they went into this campaign that became known as passive resistance, and that's what a lot of people thought Gandhi was doing. But there really are five platforms, five strategic principles that the nonconformists espoused, and basically every single one of them was not what Gandhi was doing. The first is they had negative aims. They were specific grievances, but like the denial of facilities to the untouchables later on in India, so like a salt monopoly. But Gandhi put most of his emphasis on constructive program. And just if you let him alone, he would rebuild the whole country, and there would never have to be any face-off between him and the British. But of course they did not leave him alone. The second cardinal principle for the nonconformists was the demand for an immediate response. They say, no, this is intolerable. We want this law repealed, and we want it repealed now. You know, Lord, give me patience and give it to me right away, as the old saying goes. Whereas Gandhi he knew that this thing was going to take a long, long time. And as long as they were making progress in the right direction, he was content. He actually felt that they were doing it as quickly as possible if you were aiming for a permanent change. And this is one of the many reasons that his own co-workers got seriously impatient with him. from time to time. Thirdly, Gandhi used the term evil and good, but he didn't use it in quite the hard-edged way that the nonconformists did. One of their principles was no compromise with evil. And the next step is you brand your opponent as evil, and then you say no compromise with my opponent, no matter what. And as we've already emphasized, Gandhi was very careful to use his insight and see what was absolutely essential. Cling to that for all he was worth and give up everything else. Now, sometimes the things that he thought were essential seemed peripheral to other people. See if I can think of an example. Yes, he was ready, willing, and able to give up his life to stop the division into two electorates in India for the caste Hindus and the untouchables. Because he saw that to write this into law would cast it in concrete in people's minds in a way that it could never really be undone. Other people were saying, oh, you know, it's just so what? They get to vote, we get to vote, what's the difference? But he was very uncompromising on that point. But other than that, you'll see the things that he was willing to compromise on were really amazing. Gandhi also, now another principle was invoking divine sanctions. Now Gandhi did do that. In 1934 there was a terrible earthquake in Bihar, and he claimed, well, this is a sign of God's displeasure with us for untouchability. Moreover, a year earlier when he had gone on this fast unto death and people asked him, what possessed you to do that? He said, well, I was sitting there in my jail cell feeling helpless and wondering what to do, and I heard a voice and it said, thou must go on a fast, and so forth. So it's not that Gandhi did not use that kind of vocabulary and did not make any claims to divine sanction. He did, and he would go on doing that. But he didn't do it in the way the nonconformists did, which was to say, we, our group, our project, have divine sanction, and anyone who opposes us does not. In other words, it's not – Gandhi wasn't saying that you got divine sanction just by being on the right side. You got divine sanction by getting in contact with God. And as he said, there was a way that human beings could learn how to do that. Julia, did you? Okay. Yeah.
What caste was Gandhi born into?
Gandhi was a Banya, which means that that's a subcaste within the Vaishya, or the third caste down, or second caste up, or however you want.
And he was for the caste system, but he wasn't against the untouchability part?
Yes, we'll probably have to get back to this at some point. The part that will surprise you is that he was not out to destroy the caste system. And when that struggle became quite intense in the late 30s and early 40s, he was working with this Dr. Ambedkar, who had been born out of the caste system, beneath the caste system. At one point, Ambedkar will write him a letter saying, well, Bapu, one thing we agree on is we have to get rid of this caste system, right? And to his surprise, Gandhi would write back and say, wrong.
Yeah, because it goes with the whole Dharma.
It goes with this Swadharma thing. And as long as the caste system was a sort of natural division of labor, not only wasn't he against it, but he felt that it was inevitable. If you tried to ignore it, it would only creep back in another way. And when we do things like that, we usually find that when the wheel is reinvented, it's reinvented bigger and uglier than it was before. So, but the other part of that statement to Ambedkar was, we don't have to get rid of caste, but we have to get rid of high and low. In other words, these things have to be leveled out in terms of human dignity, you know, access to divine sanction and all those things. Yeah. So that was 4 principles that we've now smashed that the passive resistors have. There's one left, and that is that they had what they called indignation meetings. They had mass meetings which were not unlike the noon rallies of certain groups on this campus. No names, please. But the point of them was to stir up people's indignation against atrocities and evil and so forth. Now, Gandhi was much more circumspect about doing that. You know, he would say things like, now the lion, which is the symbol of the British Empire, now the lion is shaking its bloody claws in our face. But he was exquisitely careful not to act under anger and at the greatest extent possible to rouse people without rousing them to anger is a very fine line there. And you can see that in Hind Swaraj. He's absolutely uncompromising about the regime and what it does to India. He calls it the fourfold curse. India is being destroyed economically, politically, culturally, and spiritually. But he adds over and over again, the British did not come here and take this country by the sword. They came here and we gave it to them. And they will not be able to stay one day past the day that we decide to take it back. In fact, in the 40s, one of the things he did was declare, okay, from now on we're independent. Just start acting like you're independent. Don't go to British law courts. Don't send your kids to British school. Of course, don't wear British cloth. And just walk around ignoring them. And it was very effective. In fact, if you wanted to look backwards in history, back in 1795, there was an episode where the French were taking control of the Sandwich Islands, and they invaded the island because the Sandwich Islanders were not paying a liquor tax. They weren't paying a liquor tax because they didn't drink liquor. But the French didn't think that this was enough of a reason not to give them money. So they landed a shipload of Marines. They even had Marines in those days. And the islanders didn't know what to do. They didn't have weapons. They sat around, had a meeting with the king, and he decided the most effective thing to do would be to ignore them. So they totally ignored them. The British, the Marines came up on shore, said hi, and they attacked a fort. There was an old fort that hadn't been used for a long, long time. So the French Marines attacked this fort and burned it to the ground, declared victory, and marched off the island. And it could be a very effective strategy that's simply not to respond when aggressive moves like that are being made. The other thing about indignation that's critical, in my view, is he was very emphatic that it was not to be anger against people. It was anger against what people were doing. It was against systems that they had established. He has this famous comment, I think in connection with his imprisonment, the 6 years imprisonment at harsh labor that came in 1931, where he said, I refuse to hate the domineering Englishmen, just as I refuse to hate domineering Hindus. But, he said, I hate from the bottom of my heart the system of government which the British have set up in India. So that was a critical distinction. He never lost focus on that distinction, and he tried to have everyone who worked with him to be like that also. And that's why Gandhi and Smuts end up being friends and so forth. So he was not doing these kind of crude indignation meetings. So that's kind of a neat way of looking at what was different and what he did create there. And I had one other quote, I can find it, from Tolstoy. Gandhi's secretary, Pyarelal, was able to cite two qualitative differences that Gandhi had added to the concept of passive resistance or the idea of nonviolence as it had been espoused by Tolstoy. And here they are. One, what Gandhi was adding, and this is close to what we started out with, that he made it into a mass movement, something that Martin Luther King will also observe. Gandhi added techniques to discipline and organize the masses, which Tolstoy had not come up with. Tolstoy, remember, was a member of the sort of lower nobility, was a count, Graf Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy, and he he resigned all of that. He emancipated his serfs, but that was about as far as close as he could get to them in terms of really having a relationship with them. Whereas Gandhi said, I'm not going to wear anything that you can't wear. I'm not going to eat anything that you can't eat. I'm going to live like you and be your spokesperson. So all the things that we've been looking at in South Africa, I'm warming up to the subject here. The ways that he brought in the laboring class and all of that, that was beyond what Tolstoy had hit upon. And the other thing was a technique for pursuing perfect goals with imperfect means. And for this, Gandhi felt it was enough if his Satyagrahis follow the principle of Satyagraha without prior conviction. As long as they're willing to follow it in their behavior and keep on learning as they're going. In other words, he didn't sit people down and say, do you swear never to have any resentment against anyone? And, you know, sit here, we're going to let a cobra crawl over your lap and see if you have any fear. It wasn't like that. You could grow into it. But if you followed it, because he did that once. He was at a prayer meeting and a cobra crawled over his lap. And, it didn't freak him out, which maybe is not as impressive to an American because we don't have poisonous serpents. Where I live, we go around looking for gopher snakes and pick them up and take them out to the garden so that nature can do its thing. But in India, you see a snake, there's just a primordial instinctive fear that comes up because those things are very, very terrifying, very fatal. So anyway, to get back to my story, you didn't have to be like a Gandhi before you joined the movement. There was this kind of pyramid where you had, you know, Gandhi said, I am your general. His style of leadership was a little bit different from what we're accustomed to, but it was still a style of leadership. He said, look, if you don't want me to be your general, just tell me, and I'm out of here in a heartbeat. But, he said, while I am your general, you will kindly do everything that I say. Then there were these 70 or 80 people packed around him very tightly who lived with him in the ashram. They didn't really eat everything that he ate. He thought they were eating everything that he ate, but they went outside and had little different fare from just the neem chutney and things like that. But mostly they were very close to him. They took some very severe vows. They were a lot heavier than just, you know, not having a latte every now and then. And they shared everything in common, did clean the latrines, classless society and so forth. They went through this training for years. And then when the time came when there was a confrontation, that would show itself. There's a very moving description that Nehru will give of being at a demonstration against the Prince of Wales. When the police came in, there was a lathi charge, you know, charging down on them with horseback and beating them with these bamboo staves. And Nehru was an expert polo player. He had been to Eton and Oxford, I think, or was it Harrow and Cambridge? I don't remember. But he found himself thinking how easy it would be to yank that British cavalryman down off his horse. He said, I know how to do this, I can. But he said long training and discipline held. And he stuck to his no guns and didn't even try to resist the blows. So there was that core group. There's Gandhi himself, there's the core group, and then it's potentially completely open-ended. And you could, in the right circumstances, you could organize 100 million people, and they wouldn't be trained and committed to the principle of nonviolence when they came in, but they would be committed to following it while they were in the action. That was how it worked. And while you were in it, you would see how it worked. You could get a taste for it, and you could grow into it. So that was an experience that a lot of people had. You know, they went in there saying, okay, I don't believe in this stuff, but I believe in Gandhiji if he wants me to be nonviolent. Oh, here, the really good example would be the Pathans in the northwest frontier, because they had a culture of revenge and violence. I mean, by the time you were 12 years old, if you were a Pathan, you knew not only how to use a rifle, you knew how to make a rifle. And it would take just like we used to do zip guns in my school in Brooklyn, but it wasn't, we didn't quite have the same revenge code that the Pathans had. It was only the smaller boys that made the zip guns, I seem to remember. But with the Pathans, it was rather different. And yet these people got these horrific beatings and did not hit back. And something happened to them. They understood a power that they had never understood before. In fact, just recently, a woman named Mukulika Banerjee went out and tried to find all of these Kudai Khidmatgars. You'll be more familiar with this whole story in a couple of weeks, I hope. But she found all of these people. There were originally 80,000 of them who had followed Abdul Ghaffar Khan, and rounded them up and took them out to a big party and interviewed them. And they said, what enabled you to do that? And they said it was the spirituality of Khan. We saw that, we understood it, and for one brief moment we were able to do superhuman things. So you pull people into this incredible mindset where they can behave in a way that they never thought they were capable of. And then you let them make their choice. So that was something that he added to Tolstoy's view. Tolstoy thought you had to completely renounce violence under any form or circumstance, and then you could be a real Christian. You could be a real part of his social movement that was happening. Okay, so that was what I wanted to say by way of wrapping up and looking back at what was discovered in South Africa. And now we're going to rewind just a little bit, about 5 years, and pause and look at this classic, Hind Swaraj. I can tell you a little bit about it in terms of background. I want to read you one paragraph from it that hits on a number of points, and then I'll open it up and we can have a discussion. He wrote this thing on board ship November 13th to November 22nd, 1909. And this is something that makes writers like me just turn green with envy, because he just wrote it in one go without, he didn't go back and cross any T's. Well, for one thing, because he's writing it in Gujarati and they don't have T's in Gujarati. But he never went back and changed anything. And it rapidly became a classic. 38 years later, they republished it and they showed it to him and said, what do you want to change? He read through it and he said, not a word. Kuch nahi. Nothing. Nothing has to be changed. And, you know, I write something, like I wrote my dissertation in Dwinell Hall between the hours of 10 p.m. and 1 in the morning over a period of 3 months. And, you know, my fellow graduate students were blown away. They said, whoa, you wrote your dissertation in 3 months. Then I read it. Oh my God. So I just tore it apart, you know, and started all over again from page 1. So this kind of suggests a kind of divine inspiration, the way he wrote this thing. As soon as it came out, it was a 50-page booklet. As soon as it came out, the government banned it. And this is going to be a good example of how when repressive regimes do things like that, it backfires on them. They banned it, and he responded by translating it into English, where, of course, it reached many, many more people. But he had originally written it in Gujarati because he was aiming it really not at the British, but at the Indians who were about to pick up the gun and take to violent revolution. That scared him more than anything. He really felt that he had only a limited amount of time to snatch this thing out of the fire. So from this time forward, he's playing this kind of difficult act where he has to rouse Indians from their torpor, and especially he has to break through their almost hypnotic fascination with the West And he has to do that for both sides, for the Indians who are just not doing anything and for the Indians who are about to take to violence. He's showing in Hind Swaraj that they're both fascinated by the West, either as victims or as participants, and he has to crank them back to discover their own civilization. It's one of the most important statements that he'll make in the book. Don't be swept off your feet by this glittery civilization. You could already see in the beginning of the 20th century that it was shallow. You know, what's that saying? If you look underneath the false tinsel of Hollywood, you'll find the real tinsel. So he had seen that. So that's why he wrote it in Gujarati, but he got it to Tolstoy in some language or other, and I guess it was probably the English translation that reached Tolstoy. In April of 1910, Tolstoy wrote in his diary, "Read Gandhi about civilization, period. Wonderful, period." And that's his testimonial. So that's the background. The reader in the book could be anyone, but he's thinking primarily of that person whose picture I showed you when we had that little slideshow, a doctor who was resident in London named Pranjivan Mehta, who was quite a considerable person with a lot of influence and prestige, and he was beginning to say that we've got to take to violence to do this. Now, just to look down the road a little bit, this is going to be a struggle that Gandhi has to wage throughout to the very end of his career, against the oppressor and against people who want to use violence against the oppressor. And for him, these are just going to be two sides of one coin. He's really against violence, however you're using it in whatever direction, and that's the point that has to be grasped. He said on one occasion, "I have 3 enemies, and are in descending order of importance. There's the British, they're really pretty easy. Then there's my fellow Indians, that's much more difficult. And finally, and most difficult of all, M.K. Gandhi." And he would find himself pitted against people like Subhash Chandra Bose, who, when the war broke out, Second World War broke out, Bose actually joined the Japanese and actually went to Berlin and met Hitler. What a privilege. He appeared in public with Hitler because if you're against the British, I'm on your side. So that goes to show you how much violence and anger Gandhi was fighting to control from the Indian side while he was fighting to repel it from the opponent's side. Okay, so at the end of chapter 8, if you have this book, this is page 38. There's an argument that struck me as, actually a lot of arguments in this book struck me that way, but it seems to me if you get at what Gandhi's getting at here, this is directly applicable to our own situation. The reader who's objecting, the reader is saying that after all, the British have brought Pax Britannica, which is modeled on Pax Romana, which is in turn going to be a model for Pax Americana, that after all they brought Pax Britannica to India, meaning there's a certain kind of social unrest, and there are hereditary, this is one kind of unfortunate aspect of the caste system, and there were hereditary bandits, and it was a caste. And there were these groups, they said, that's what I do. I rob people, cut off their fingers, and wear them around my neck as a necklace. Angulimala, one of the characters that the Buddha had to confront. And they really could make life pretty difficult and awkward. And as a matter of fact, this still goes on. The Bills in particular still do a certain kind of hereditary banditry, which is just as bad as unhereditary banditry if you're the one who's getting your car jacked or whatever it is that's happening. And so there's a reference to three of these groups. Editor, that is, Gandhi says, I do not call the situation in India peace. You may see peace if you like, I see none. What he's getting at here is what we call positive peace, which I've defined as a situation, or let's just say a regime, a situation in which all parties desire one another's welfare. That's peace. But a situation in which the parties who don't desire your welfare are held down by force is not peace from a Gandhian point of view. So Gandhi says, you can call it peace if you like, I don't. And the reader says, you make light of the terror that the thugs, the Pindaris, and the Bhils were to the country. So these are these three of the groups who did this kind of thing. And of course, this is where we get our word thug. These thuggies. Wasn't it Richard Nixon who said, I am not a thug? Or I am not a crook. That's right, I'm not a crook. That's a different word. Yeah. Whatever it was he thought he was not. And then Gandhi says, if you give the matter some thought, you will see that the terror was by no means such a mighty thing. If it had been, other people would have died away before the British advent. They would have overwhelmed the country if it was really a serious menace before the British got here. And as a matter of fact, there will be a famous episode after Gandhi is assassinated when one of his disciples, probably the person who is considered closest to him spiritually, a man named Vinoba Bhave, will be going through an area in Maharashtra where there were Dacoits, is another type of hereditary bandit, and Bhave will issue a call to the Dacoits saying, you come in, surrender your guns to me, and you will be punished according to law, but no more than that. We won't pursue your families or anything like that. And there's even a photograph of Bhave sitting there with, did I show you a slide of that? You have a slide? Anyway, it's worth repeating. A Bhave sitting there at the foot of a tree in sort of a yogic position, and these very expensive weapons in front of him, which these people are unslinging, high-powered rifles and binoculars and stuff like that, turning themselves into him. So that's an important little event because it shows that you can use nonviolence against terrorists. But then he goes on to make a second point. Moreover, the present peace is only nominal, for by it we have become emasculated and cowardly. That was an image that Gandhi used a lot, emasculated. We are not to assume that the English have changed the nature of the Pindaris and the Bhils. It is therefore better to suffer the Pindari peril than that someone else should protect us from it and thus render us effeminate. I hope you don't take offense at his use of effeminate in this context, but the point is that for him, it was primary that you handled your own defense. Now, just look at our own situation for a minute. Recently passed away friend of mine, Norman Cousins, discovered that in the 50s, well, it wasn't he that discovered it, that's right. The Freedom of Information Act discovered that in the late 50s, the US Navy was testing bacteriological weapons. And one of the ways that they tested it was they sailed around the bay, our bay, the East Bay out here, and they sprayed bacteria into the fog to see what would happen. Well, guess what? Some people got sick from this bacteria, which were very virulent. And in fact, one person who was an elderly man, this is the days before the flu shot, anyway, this is bacteria, so that wouldn't count. This person died, and his grandchildren discovered it when the Freedom of Information Act came out with this fact, and they sued the Navy. And Norman Cousins made a very interesting point. Now, this is a person who was totally against war. He was one of the first Americans to be into Hiroshima. After the war, he rounded up the what are called the Hiroshima Maidens and brought them to America for reconstructive surgery, all the rest of it. Just complete pacifism. However, he said, look, if you want to sue them, go ahead and sue them because that was a horrible thing to do. They're supposed to be protecting us and they killed us. But, he said, there's no point in getting indignant about it. We should be learning the lesson. The lesson is that the minute you hire somebody else to protect you, you have given away your essential freedoms. And they're going to protect you in the way that they see fit and not in the way that you see fit. So this is a very important principle, and I'd say it's very relevant to us when the president after 9/11 says, you know, take the kids to Disneyland. My job is to protect the American people, and the American people's job is to go to Disneyland and not get involved. He is encouraging us to give up our own protection. And this will, of course, be a big issue in the mid-40s when there's a threat of a Japanese invasion, and Gandhi is being pretty much held under by the British through that whole period. He's in prison most of the time, but he actually argues that the British should leave India and let them defend themselves. And the British said, you know, you guys don't have an army, and we do. The minute we pull out of here, the Japanese are going to swarm in and take over the country. We are the only thing that's protecting you. After the war, a couple of little documents came to light, and one of them was the defense plan for India, the British defense plan for India. And guess what that plan said? The first Japanese that puts his toe over that line from Burma into India, we're getting the hell out of there. That was how they planned to defend the country, which was to Amscray. And the document said, oh, well, we'll leave a garrison in some strategic places. But there's some strategic places in a country the size of India. So on the one hand, they were lying because they really had no intention of, quote, defending India. But on the other hand, it's also been shown, and this is a little bit more theoretical, that to the extent that the Japanese were planning to invade India, they were planning to do so because of the British Army. They wanted to fight the British in India. It's not that they mainly wanted to occupy India, though if you handed it to them, they probably would have taken it at that time. So the logic that you have to have other people to defend you is, if you pardon my French, a completely screwed up logic. And the minute you buy into that, you really have given up your, well, to use Gandhi's terminology, you've given up your manhood or your womanhood. So one of the characteristics of nonviolent defense is that it can be done by everybody and not by military elite. We'll get back to that when we talk about civilian-based defense later on, but this is a very important point. And he goes on to say, it is better to suffer the Pindari peril than that someone else should protect us from it. I guess I already said that. I should prefer to be killed by the arrow of a bhil than to seek unmanly protection. Then he goes on to give various arguments that buttress these major points. Okay, so I thought that might serve as an introduction. Now, Hind Swaraj, it was written at a time when Gandhi was very outspoken. Okay, so he's going to say some things in this book which are more hard-edged than he would say later on. You know, like railroads are bad and things like that. So take that into account. But you will find a lot of extremely interesting arguments here on the subject of, for example, history, democracy, so forth. I want to make sure we hit those two. Okay, so who has any comments? Anything you noticed? I'm happy to drone on and on. I mean, not true. It's not nearly as much fun, but I could drone on and on, but I'd much rather talk with you guys than at you guys. Yeah, Camilla.
I found it interesting that in one of the songs on page 57, he's talking about using history as
Yes.
a way to, like, you know, I guess
Yeah.
I mean, can be
So Camilla is talking about a place where I think we actually have to start, which is the question of history, because you've probably noticed this already. You go back to Unit 3 or wherever you are, and you start telling people that you're taking this nonviolence course, and they'll say, "Are you crazy? Have you never read history?" And they go and read history, quote unquote, and there's no nonviolence in that history. But as we've mentioned already, there's an obvious reason for that, and that is that people are not looking for it. And when nonviolence happens, they don't notice it. It's like nothing happened at all. And when violence breaks out, they say, aha, an event, and they record that event, and they patch together those. What Gandhi calls actually what they're doing is looking at the breakdowns in the course of nature. When the system breaks down, they rush in and record it. It's not unlike this famous person in Vienna, about 18 years later, who was trying to explain the human personality by studying neurotics. You know, you wait until somebody breaks down, goes wrong, they have this disturbance, you study that, which you can do, you know, there's nothing wrong with studying the pathology, but there's something very wrong about taking the pathology for the health. So similarly, historians as a profession had no concept of what the overall sweep of human destiny was and what human beings are striving to achieve consciously or mostly unconsciously. There were a few people like Eric Vogelin at Stanford and a few others who were called historicists. That is, they had an overview. They didn't just study a period. But I venture to say, if you go into the history department today, at our university or even at universities that are not quite as good as, of course, none of the others is, and you say, well, I want to take a kind of grand overview. So, you know, where have we gotten since the days of cannibalism? And you know, I want to look at the rising trend of nonviolence. I think they'll tell you to get an independent study somewhere in Stevens Hall. So that's one point. Now, the other point that you were talking about, Camilla, is if you want to understand the history of India, you have to understand certain things about India which Western writers did not understand. One of them is the decentralization. The British came in and said, oh my God, this place is a mess. There's no central ruler. You don't even have a name for yourself. Because the name India is actually a distortion of a Persian mispronunciation of the river Sindhu. The Indians never called themselves India. They called themselves the place where Bharata's rainfall falls, Bharatvarsha, Bharata being a mythological king. So they did not understand that there could be the kind of unity and diversity which pertained. And there was a lot of things that they got wrong. One of the ones that they constantly got wrong was the depth of passion that people had around their religion. And that's why it always blew up in their face. But this is kind of, I think, a sine qua non. If we don't get this point, if someone doesn't get this point, they won't be able to get anywhere with nonviolence. And if you want to study the history of nonviolence, you have to go back and do it basically on your own. Right now, there are a few people who are trying to write histories of nonviolence, and they're mostly looked upon as revisionists, because of revising like the history of the American Revolution, where we go out and say if we didn't have the war, we would still be part of the British Empire. And these historians have been showing since the early 60s that we probably would have gotten independence earlier without the war. So that's just one aspect of it. Another is looking at popular movements which were not formal and sometimes didn't even have a name and yet accomplished big political changes. It's very difficult to study those. We don't know how to do it. There was a third and particularly brilliant point I was going to make, but it slipped away from me. So that's a good place to start the history thing. even in terms of, this isn't the brilliant point, but it's a nice point. Even as we were saying earlier, in terms of evaluating the success of a nonviolent episode, even there we have to train ourselves to look for certain connections. For example, the Czechs have this nonviolent civil-based resistance in the spring of 1968, spring in the summer. And if you look at it and say, oh, well, after 8 months the Soviets occupied Czechoslovakia, therefore it was a failure. But you could also say that the Czechs tested themselves and showed themselves that they could resist even if they didn't have a military advantage. Like in a way they could resist better. It was a lot more fun. And so sure enough, when the Soviet Union collapses 20 or so years down the line, of all the East European countries, they were the one that came out of it with least damage, least residue of hatred, very, very few people even injured in their liberation. They had learned from that lesson what they could do, and they did it 20 years later. Again, this is something that would be difficult for a historian to come along and prove. Okay. Other main points about Hind Swaraj. Sid?
I have a question. I don't
Yeah.
know, this might be insanely broad right now, but
It'd be hard to be more insanely broad than I've been being already. Go ahead.
with just like reading all this stuff, reading Hind Swaraj, reading Bhagavad Gita, it seems to me that Gandhi is basing so much of his work on this like underlying spirituality
Yeah.
and moral codes of India, and he
Yeah.
sees a lot of the West as just not having that, not being based on these certain things. So what do you think that says about any possibility of nonviolence, say in America, where we've constantly having this Western frontier pushing
Yeah.
forward? There was never this like agrarian village
Yeah.
culture.
Let's see if I can paraphrase what you're saying, Sid. Especially in Hind Swaraj, he does not hold out a whole lot of hope for Western civilization.
Basically, or just like where would we even start?
Yeah, where would we start?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that no one could disagree with you. He calls it satanic, which is not a nice word. And he is fully conscious that it is a clash of civilizations that's going on. But he's also very clear that it is not the British that he's against, but their system. Really anybody, if you get down deep enough, they have the same values and the same capacities. But what he's saying is that this thing called Western civilization, you remember where he talks about the Gujarati word for civilization being something like politeness or something like that. The Western system has not encouraged the best values in people. Whereas, despite its problems, whatever you want to say about India being backward and the poverty, which basically was caused by external exploitation, whatever you want to say about it, they had a civilization which attempted to foster the spiritual values. It's really, I suppose you could say it was unique. The matter of degree maybe, but it was sort of unique. Like just as we have documents and institutions, they had what they call their parampara, or their tradition of illumined people. And there was never a period of time when there wasn't somebody who had made this incredible breakthrough. Now, Gandhi, however, was perfectly well aware that India was the laboratory where he could most easily demonstrate that a spiritual civilization could be made to work. But once he had demonstrated it there, it could be picked up anywhere. Now, when he's writing Hind Swaraj, he wasn't saying that last piece very loudly because he's talking to people who've absolutely dazzled by Western civilization. They think if you can get in a train and go 60 miles an hour, you're 30 times better than somebody who's going just a few miles per hour in a bullock cart. So he has to break that spell. But okay, your practical question is where would you even begin? Well, after all is said and done, if he's right about human nature, then we are going to reach a point, and he predicts it, where people will say, what have we done? We've gone too far down this road, and now we need to go back. And we need to discover spirituality of our own, and that's why we will be talking about what the Judeo-Christian heritage really is in a few weeks. But if there was that underlying cultural advantage in India, there were also certain disadvantages. People in India were, by this time, pretty darn passive. So he had to light a fire under them to get them from tamas to rajas so that he could get them from rajas to sattva. In America, up until recently, I would say, you don't have that problem. You know, a Canadian friend of mine was telling me a joke about getting oysters out of Lake Ontario or something, and they've noticed that the oysters on the Canadian side are very docile. The oysters on the American side are so that's actually an advantage, and there's no question that I think we're starting to discover this now in nonviolence. Every culture has advantages and disadvantages. So it's a question of finding the advantages and working with them, working against the disadvantages. And, you know, that might be a good thing for us to do toward the end of the semester. Sit down and take a good look at ourselves qua Americans and say, what have we got going for us if we wanted to build this kind of thing? And what is going against us? Yeah. Julia?
I was thinking of, had a similar question along similar lines as far as secular movements, and I was thinking a lot about the civil rights movement and how they really had so many inspired leaders, which is something it seems like we're really lacking right now. But they were inspired by Christianity and they were ministers, and it had that whole kind of flair to it. And so I was thinking about the possibilities of secular movements in the West, and it's like, it seems like there are no other avenues.
Right. Well, now I have to admit we have gotten pretty far from Hind Swaraj, but you know, that's okay. So Julia is asking, what are the possibilities for a secular movement, given the fact that the civil rights movement was not one? There's no question about that. I've noticed a pattern, and I've even published it, so I've stuck my neck out on this one, that there seem to be three waves of nonviolence and in the modern era. And the first is the period from Gandhi to King, where you have inspired leadership, Gandhi, King, Chavez, you might say, inspired leadership and the spiritual energy that you can tap into. And the second wave would be insurrectionary struggles that happened all over Europe, where you didn't have that kind of individual leadership of, if you take we'll do this next semester, of course. You take the Philippine insurrection in 86. Christianity played into that in a very helpful and very useful way. So you have some leaders like Corazon Aquino and some spirituality, but it's more broad-based. And the third wave, which I think we're into now, is characterized by the WTO demonstrations in, when was that, 99? Something like that. Where whole new kinds of organization had to be developed because people were actually anti-leadership. So it's come a long way since Gandhi says, I am your general. You either fire me or do everything that I say. Anyone who stood up and said that in Seattle would be find himself a one-way hitchhiker back down to Los Angeles or wherever he or she had come from. It's a completely different style, which I thought myself was impossible. I thought you could not do this without some kind of leadership. Furthermore, there's a new kind of spirituality that seems to be available to people that isn't limited to a particular religious framework. And there are a lot of these, like in the context of, take a look at the time here, in the context of third-party nonviolent intervention, a lot of the teams, some of the teams are just completely secular, like Peace Brigades International, Some of them are connected with a special religion, like Christian peacemaker teams, and some of them are interfaith, and they have interfaith services. So it's both a disadvantage that you don't have a particular religious focus, but after all, that's what we've got in the modern age, and you can learn to live with that and use that also. Now, I've often said that nonviolence is the link between spiritual development and social change, and that's why it's going to play a very, very prominent role as we go on. Okay. I did want to say a few things about the India period, but let's take some more time. There are a couple of really major points I want to make sure we touch on in Hind Swaraj. But isn't there a part of the text where you read it and said, this is crazy, why is he saying this? You know, or even this is politically incorrect? Or that was something that was fascinating. Yeah?
In one of his letters, it's probably, I don't know if it's in it's a supplementary one, but
A little louder, please.
medical science is the concentrated essence of black magic.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, this is particularly, I thought you pre-med students would pick up on this, that medical science is black magic. Well, okay, who would like to try and get at, what was his objection, Joy?
Well, I mean, the term black magic, too, I think has a negative connotation, or maybe it shouldn't.
Okay, but let's take him on his own terms for the time being. It does have a negative.
I think that there's like an underlying spiritual thing that's going on in medicine that maybe he's mentioning, that it is spiritual, but it's disguised as being this strictly scientific practice.
It's conceivable that there's something spiritual about medicine that he wasn't seeing. But what was his objection to it?
Maybe the lack of the spiritual element.
Well, but more particularly, how would that show up? What's wrong with going to a doctor if you're sick? Alex?
He was saying that it made it possible for people to overindulge
Right.
themselves because they could just get a cure for whatever they did to their own body.
Right. Right. Let's say overeating, for example, which is very popular in the U.S. You go into it and then you expect medical science to patch you up, like they'll sew up your stomach, or they do these horrendous things to you to make it physically impossible to go on doing that. And the result of that is that you don't grow. Now, isn't this exactly parallel to what we were saying before about defense? It's like relying on somebody else to defend you, and therefore preventing you from learning how to defend yourself, which will require you to grow spiritually. So that was his main objection.
Just
Okay. Yeah. Good. And of course, it also was being used as an instrument of domination. That hasn't been clear until recently, but there's a Sri Lankan writer who wrote a book called Prevented Development, and I'm not getting it exactly right, but this person showed that up until the middle or the third quarter of the 18th century, most sciences in India, for example, and in other Asian countries were exactly at a par with Western sciences. They were ahead in astronomy, maybe a little behind in some other things. Medicine was much better, and it's this technological revolution that enabled Western science to shoot ahead in a particular way, which is fine. But then the idea comes about that that's the only way that science is, and other countries didn't have science at all because they didn't have a Western type, and then that becomes an instrument of domination. Yeah.
Well, also like with drug companies now, like the idea of a for-profit medicine is
Oh, yeah. Well,
terrible.
he hadn't even gotten there yet. I mean, if he were alive today. But, for example, I mentioned poisonous reptiles in India. There's an institution at the village level in India called Vishavaidyas, which means poison doctors. And again, this is a hereditary caste. Your father was a Vishavaidya. You become one, you inherit his garden, you know where all these plants are. And if anyone is bitten by a snake, they bring that person to you, You take a look at the bite, you can tell what bit that person, and you can tell which plant to use to treat it. And now here's the thing. For hundreds of years, these people have been practicing this, and they are not allowed to charge money. And you can see why. You know, you've been bitten by a cobra, you've got about an hour to live, and the doctor says, oh, I can cure you. What kind of health insurance do you have? You know, so you'll give up everything in a situation like that. So they are not allowed to gain money for practicing that type of medicine. And that is one way of preserving what the ideology of the profession originally was. Yeah. So before we got to even any of those corrupting influences, what Gandhi is saying is to expect somebody else to cure you instead of taking care of yourself. You are, again, to use his terms, you're emasculating yourself. Camilla?
What I also think is kind of smart of him and he put in was even if you don't agree with that statement, it's against your religion to kill the doctors. He actually says that it's like animal activists would be very happy about this. He says that like in order to make these medicines, they kill tons of animals in the process, and you know a lot of the medicines actually have animal fat.
Yeah.
And then stuff. So he's saying like even if you're not there with me, you should do it anyway.
Yeah, you shouldn't do it because of the cost to animals, but he will say later on that this idea of animal protection in India has a spiritual purpose, and that is to make us aware of the unity of life. So if you don't grasp the unity of life, it's like what we were saying about nonviolence. You don't grok it, you don't have that kind of feeling for animals, you do it because it's your religion. You could grow into it from that perspective. Fact is that Gandhi went very, very far with this ideology. And on one occasion, Kasturba was quite ill, and a Western doctor said to him she has to have beef injections. And to him, the idea of injecting beef into the veins of a Hindu woman who hadn't had meat for centuries was absolute anathema. Kasturba was not conscious at that time. He had to make the decision, and he decided not to do it. And she did recover on that occasion. But a lot of people said, you know, this is like some quackery, some Christian Science stuff. But he had consulted with Pyaralal's sister, Sushila Nair. She had had Western education, Western medical education. He said, Sushila, do you think that Kasturba needs a beef injection, and can you guarantee me that it will save her? And Sushila said, I'm not sure whether she needs it or not, and I absolutely cannot guarantee that it will save her. It's just, you know, something we're hoping for. And that was, I'm seeing a very close parallel to the pending invasion by Japan in the 40s, where they would not allow him to practice his native medicine techniques, which I have to say, this is like the wackiest side of Gandhi. I follow Gandhi in a lot of things, but I do not take mud packs when I'm having an allergy attack or stuff like that. I don't know, who knows, maybe I'm wrong, but this is one place where I have not followed him. But they wouldn't let him practice what he knew how to practice, and then they said, look, Kasturba is helpless, she needs a Western type intervention. Similarly, they would not let him organize nonviolent resistance against the Japanese. And then they said, look, your country is helpless. You need a Western-style army to defend it. So it's the same kind of logic, and you can't blame him for not accepting it. Whoa. Well, we'll talk about the first few years in India next time. Let me just mention one topic that I'd like you to go back and look at. We do have just a few minutes. In Hind Swaraj, this seems to me could really give us some trouble, and that is where he talks about the limitations of democracy. Because personally, for me, democracy is a sacred word, and I don't think that there's any problems with democracy per se. There's problems with the way people use it. And I don't want to necessarily get into exactly what they are, but his problems with it are threefold. the way democratic systems are being set up, they are methods of representation which do not allow the individual any expression, any meaningful political weight in the system. You know, even a Denis Kucinich, who is, I'm thinking of him because one of the things I most regret about my bicycle being stolen this week was it had a Kucinich sticker on it, which was probably worth more than the bicycle. But anyway, I'm sorry, I shouldn't drag my personal problems in here. Even Denis Kucinich, who has a party apparatus behind him, is very limited in what he can do, and it really seems like the closer you are to your own values, the less effective you are in the political system. Okay, so then you take this flawed political system and you say, because we have this mother of parliaments, we have to bring democracy to the world. And look at you, you have these maharajas ruling over you, you need to be liberated. Now, does that sound familiar? Okay, so if you don't have democracy, we're going to bomb you until you get it. You know? So that is his third objection, that once, oh sorry, that's the second objection. Once you have a flawed system like that, you can still use the name of that system, and in its sacred name you can go and exploit other people. When we get to talk about religions later on, I'm going to be talking about how you start off with a revelation, that revelation gets watered down, and pretty soon you have nothing left but the authority. And you attach that authority to the opposite of what that religion stood for. The third thing was that without nonviolence, democracy was invalid. Because, he said, democracy, so long as it is sustained by violence, cannot provide for or protect the weak. My notion of democracy is that under it, the weakest should have the same opportunity as the strongest. I would even go a little bit deeper and say something that I think he probably believed in. That is, if you look at the underlying principle of democracy, what it really is rooted in is the worth of the individual, the value of the individual. And all the safeguards that we have built into our constitutional system are to provide for the individual or the small group not being exploited or put upon by the majority. I mean, I remember being told when I was a kid in school, it's the decisions of the majority and the rights of the minority. Those two things are necessary. Now, the only way to protect the rights of the minority or the weakest is by including nonviolence in the system. And in fact, if you're looking at principled nonviolence, that is, after all, what it's based on. It is the sanctity, the inviolability, and the infinite creativity of the individual. So all these things start to converge at the center. So what he was almost angry about, as angry as a Mahatma can get, was the use of this flawed system, which is really a disguised way of exploiting others and turning it into something violent. Now, you will read sometimes among political scientists that democracies have less of a tendency to go to war against one another than non-democracies. Statistically, that's correct. But there's also a fascinating argument in Immanuel Kant that really for war-fighting, democracies are worse than monarchies because everybody is doing it, and the whole culture has to get behind it, whereas in a monarchy, you know, it's just the king and his or her minions. Okay, so those are some major points that come up with Hind Swaraj. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll finally get back to India next week. Yeah.